I want to draw a distinction between overlapping but somewhat different eating disorder behaviors. The first is dietary restriction, which refers to actual undereating, meaning eating fewer calories than one's body needs in order to maintain a certain weight. If dietary restriction goes on long enough, weight is lost and a dangerously low weight can be achieved in the case of anorexia nervosa. Dietary restraint, on the other hand, represents attempted dieting by trying to follow multiple demanding, rigid, and perfectionistic dietary rules. I use the word attempted because most people with eating disorders have periods where they follow their dietary restraint rules and diet in a strict fashion, but those periods are interspersed with episodes of uncontrolled eating that often compensate calorically for any undereating that has occurred. It is these dietary restraint rules that must be followed in order for the individual with the eating disorder to feel as though he or she is in control of eating and therefore in control of weight and shape. Dietary restraint rules tend to cluster around specific themes. These include what to eat, how much to eat, when to eat, and how to eat. Rules concerning what to eat split foods into safe versus unsafe categories, or healthy versus unhealthy categories. Foods in the unsafe or unhealthy categories are typically completely avoided. Patients may also refuse to eat in settings where they cannot know or control what is in a specific food or how it is prepared. So for example, someone might be willing to eat frozen pizza that has nutrition facts available, but be unwilling to eat pizza out at a restaurant where there is more uncertainty. Rules concerning how much to eat tend to involve limits on fat grams or carbohydrates or calories. They may also involve limits on the numbers of servings or number of items that are allowable at any given meal. Patients may, for example, think it's okay to eat dessert once a day, but not to have a dessert-like food at multiple meals in any given day. These rules tend to be motivated by an attempt to reduce the total number of calories consumed and therefore control weight and shape. Rules involving what to eat often involve delaying eating until when to eat often involve delaying eating until a certain time of day or not eating past a certain time. Delaying eating is often motivated by an attempt to restrict the total number of calories consumed per day and by a belief that there is something inherently good about delaying eating and tolerating hunger. Rules about not eating after a certain time often stem from a distorted belief that energy absorption differs depending on the time of day. For example, the patient might fear that food consumed late at night or right before sleeping will be more likely to be stored as fat than if the same amount of calories are consumed earlier in the day. A specific eating disorder behavior called deading falls into this category, in which patients delay eating until they believe they have earned it by creating a calorie deficit through fasting or exercise first. Rules about how to eat can involve eating foods in specific orders, typically the lower calorie options first. This likely arises due to a desire to suppress appetite. Individuals with eating disorders may also develop rules about pacing, such as not being the first to start eating or the first to finish in situations where social comparisons are possible. Another example is attempting to eat less than anyone else present, or just avoiding eating in front of others altogether. And these rules tend to be motivated by fears of social judgment. People with eating disorders often do not see their dieting and their dietary restraint rules as a problem, even if they are in recovery and have extinguished other eating disorder behaviors, like restriction or purging. This may be in part because dietary restraint is socially valued. Others quickly recognize that behaviors like purging or being underweight are harmful, but might still praise a person in early recovery for eating healthy, or, in other words, a restrained fashion. Dietary restraint is an egocentric behavior for several reasons. Dieting is something people with eating disorders value and something they identify with. It provides them with a sense of control and positive self-esteem. It is also their main method of weight control. It is also viewed as a way to compensate for binge eating that has occurred, or as a way to prevent future binge eating. Binge eaters are often tempted to recommit themselves to their dietary restraint rules after a binge in order to undo the damage that they've done, so to speak. They may also believe that they can prevent binge eating in the future by avoiding foods that they have binged on in the past. People with eating disorders tend to blame themselves when they are unable to follow their dietary restraint rules. They call themselves gluttonous, lazy, greedy, or out of control, and they tend not to blame the unrelenting and demanding nature of the rules themselves for any difficulties they have in following and obeying them. Dietary restraint is, however, a major problem and is therefore a major target of treatment for several reasons in CBT for eating disorders. It is a major cause of preoccupation with food and eating in individuals with eating disorders. Normal eaters tend to think about food only about 5, 10, or 15% of the time, usually when they are hungry or right before a meal and when they're deciding what to eat. These thoughts are not time-consuming, nor are they experienced as distressing by a normal eater. But when people start to restrain their eating, whether they have an eating disorder or not, there is a fairly instant increase in their food thoughts, perhaps up to about 30% of their mental time and energy. And these thoughts tend to be much more aversive in nature, such as thoughts related to feelings of deprivation or guilt. The pressure of following dietary restraint rules also makes eating anxiety-provoking beforehand and guilt-ridden if the rules are not followed perfectly. Eating therefore becomes emotional and unpleasant. It is something to fear and avoid. Eating also becomes rigid and stereotyped if there are too many demanding rules. Dietary restraint is also a major contributor to binge eating. If you recall from the video on the conceptualization of bulimia, it is the reaction to breaking the dietary restraint rules that maintains binge eating. If you have a very rigid and black and white rule, such as no chocolate, you will feel like a total failure after eating any amount of chocolate, and the resulting feelings of guilt and demoralization make it tempting just to satisfy your cravings anyway, and then purge and/or recommit to strict dieting the next day. There's a tendency just to throw in the towel and say, what the hell, if you feel like a total failure. It is therefore no accident that binge eaters binge on the very foods that they are attempting to avoid or limit. Dietary restraint also limits the ability to eat socially. It's important, or it's difficult to go out on a successful date if you can only eat safe foods or if you can only eat foods that you know the exact composition of. Dietary restraint is also the foundation of restriction, and if a low weight is achieved due to actual restriction, a whole new host of problems arises, as discussed in the video on being underweight and undereating. The solution to dietary restraint is actually quite straightforward and easy to explain, although of course much more difficult and challenging for someone with an eating disorder to actually do. The principles are essentially those of exposure and response prevention therapy and systematic desensitization. The first step is to identify all of the dietary restraint rules in place. They tend to be written in the form of a commandment or a do or don't kind of rule. A helpful question to ask in order to identify rules concerning what to eat or what not to eat is a question like, what foods found in a grocery store would the patient be afraid to eat due to a fear that his or her weight or shape would change for the worse? In other words, what are the foods that will make the patient fear weight gain or feel fat and out of control? Other rules can be illuminated by asking questions like, what would be difficult about potentially having to go over to a friend's house for a dinner party without knowing in advance what will be served? It's also helpful to identify what fears and beliefs are motivating each rule. Often this shows what basic nutritional education is needed and what myths promoted by the dietary industry might need to be clarified for the patient. The third step is then to break the rules. Not every rule and not every avoided food necessarily needs to be directly challenged. Often a single food or experience will challenge an entire class of avoided foods or dietary restraint rules. It's best for the patient to challenge rules when support is available or on a day when they are feeling good and are unlikely to succumb to urges to binge or compensate. In terms of avoided food, not much of the actual food has to be eaten in order for the rule itself to be challenged. It might just take a bite or two. Patients may also need to develop a distraction plan or a coping plan, or might need to learn distress tolerance skills in order to help them cope with the anxiety and the guilt that a good exposure will create. Rule breaking, then, as a fourth step, should be repeated until the patient can break the rule without feeling any guilt or anxiety. There are also some more adaptive beliefs about eating that can be shared with the patient in order to help challenge distorted thoughts and beliefs that motivate dietary restraint rules. For patients who fear becoming unhealthy, it can be helpful to point out that the goal of exposures and of recovery is not to encourage unhealthy eating. The goal is to eliminate guilt and anxiety surrounding eating so that the patient can freely choose what to eat, which is something they lack at the moment. Also, if the patient makes a list of consequences of their eating disorder versus a list of consequences for eating even the standard American diet, chances are the eating disorder will lose out in that comparison. Beliefs related to weight and shape can be challenged by teaching that no food is inherently fattening. It is the amount, or in other words, the calories and energy balance that matter in terms of weight and shape. 2,000 calories worth of lettuce has the same effect on weight and shape as 2,000 calories worth of ice cream or cheese or fried chicken. The right amount of food is the amount that allows the patient to maintain a healthy weight and follows widely accepted nutritional guidelines. For patients who fear social judgment, it can be helpful to point out that others without eating disorders do not share the patient's harsh beliefs about weight, shape, and eating, and therefore will not judge them negatively for eating in a less restrained way. They may even find eating with the patient much more enjoyable and relaxed, or be proud of the patient for displaying the courage it takes to do exposures. Many others, even with eating disorders, are also unlikely to judge the patient as harshly as they would judge themselves. There is a double standard at work. Rules about eating less than anyone else around can be compared to rules like breathing less than anyone else. If everyone did this, the human race, of course, would quickly become extinct. These comparisons also fail to take into account important differences in weight, height, energy needs, activity level, and what others have eaten earlier in the day or will eat later. It is also helpful to point out that there is nothing inherently good about resisting eating. Whatever willpower or self-discipline that this demonstrates results only in willpower for the sake of having willpower, and does not actually give the patient more control over other areas of his or her life.